The marble floors of First National Bank of Chicago gleamed under the afternoon sunlight, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows as I approached the customer service desk, wearing my best suit and carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to my late father. I was Thomas Williams, 32 years old, and about to make the biggest financial transaction of my life. "Excuse me," I said politely to the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that seemed genuine. "I'd like to speak with someone about opening a business account and applying for a commercial loan." She looked me up and down, her smile faltering slightly as she took in my appearance. I was well dressed, but my suit was off the rack rather than custom-tailored. My shoes were polished but showed wear, and my briefcase, while real leather, had seen better days. "What type of business?" she asked, her tone shifting from welcoming to cautious. "I'm starting a tech consulting firm. I have contracts lined up with several major corporations, and I need banking services for a company that will be processing significant revenue within the first year." The receptionist's expression became skeptical. "I see. Let me get Mrs. Victoria Sterling, our branch manager. She handles situations like this." The way she said situations like this sent a chill down my spine, but I maintained my composure. I'd worked too hard to get to this point, to let subtle discrimination derail my plans. Mrs. Victoria Sterling emerged from a glass office 15 minutes later, her appearance screaming money and privilege. She was in her early 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Her jewelry was understated but expensive, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "Mr. Williams, is it?" she said, extending a manicured hand that felt cold and reluctant in my grip. "I understand you're interested in commercial banking services." "That's correct. I'm launching Williams Tech Solutions, and I need to establish business banking relationships for what will be a 7-figure operation within 18 months. Mrs. Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly, but not with interest, with barely concealed amusement. 7 figures? That's quite ambitious. Why don't we step into my office and discuss your situation? Her office was a testament to corporate success: mahogany desk, leather chairs, awards and certifications covering the walls, and a view of downtown Chicago that spoke of high-level connections and serious money. Mrs. Sterling gestured to a chair across from her desk and settled into her own chair with the air of someone preparing to deliver disappointing news. "Mr. Williams, I've reviewed the basic information my assistant gathered, and I have to be honest with you. Our commercial lending programs have very specific requirements. I understand that. I've brought financial projections, contract agreements, and references from—" "Let me stop you there," Mrs. Sterling interrupted, holding up one perfectly manicured hand. "Mr. Williams, I'm sure you're well-intentioned, but commercial lending isn't about hopes and dreams. It's about established businesses with proven track records, significant collateral, and, frankly, the kind of connections that ensure success." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression of someone examining an interesting but ultimately disappointing specimen. "Our business accounts require minimum deposits of $250,000, and our commercial loans start at $500,000 with very strict qualification criteria." "I understand the requirements, Mrs. Sterling. I have the documentation to show I can meet them." "Mr. Williams," she said, her tone becoming patronizing, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's be realistic. Tech consulting is a crowded field, and frankly, without the right background, the right connections, the right profile, these ventures rarely succeed at the level you're describing." The word profile hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that made my jaw clench. I was a black man in an expensive suit, but apparently that wasn't enough to overcome Mrs. Sterling's preconceptions about who belonged in her world of high-level commercial banking. "What exactly do you mean by the right profile?" I asked quietly. Mrs. Sterling's smile became even more condescending. "Mr. Williams, I mean someone with a proven business track record, established connections in the corporate world, and the kind of background that banks feel comfortable investing in. These programs, she gestured vaguely at her computer screen, they aren't really designed for people like you. The words hit me like a physical blow. People like me. People without significant business experience, without established wealth, without the kind of corporate connections that ensure success in competitive markets. I'm not trying to be unkind, Mr. Williams, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't manage your expectations appropriately. I sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. Mrs. Victoria Sterling, branch manager of one of Chicago's most prestigious banks, had just told me that commercial banking services weren't for people like me, and we both knew exactly what she meant. Mrs. Sterling, I said carefully, are you refusing to review my qualifications for commercial banking services? I'm trying to save you time and disappointment. Perhaps you'd be better served by one of our personal banking representatives. We have some very nice savings account options that might be more appropriate for your current situation. The dismissal was complete. In Mrs. Sterling's mind, I was someone who belonged in the retail banking area with students and minimum wage workers, not in her office discussing serious money and business opportunities. I see. I stood up, gathering my briefcase and maintaining my dignity, despite the humiliation burning in my chest. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Sterling. Of course, Mr. Williams. I hope you understand that I'm just trying to be helpful. Banking is a complicated business, and it's important to have realistic expectations. As I walked out of her office, I could feel Mrs. Sterling's eyes on my back, probably already forgetting about the black man who'd had the audacity to think he belonged in her world of high-level commercial banking. But what Mrs. Sterling didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to discover because she'd been too busy making assumptions based on my appearance, was that I wasn't just another hopeful entrepreneur with big dreams and limited resources. I was Thomas Williams, son of Robert Williams, who had built a small construction company into a multi-million-dollar operation before his death 6 months ago. I was the heir to a business empire worth over $12 million, with active contracts, established relationships, and more liquid assets than Mrs. Sterling probably processed in a typical month. More importantly, I was the newest member of the board of directors for Midwest Financial Holdings, the parent company that owned First National Bank of Chicago and 47 other financial institutions across the region. As I walked through the bank's marble lobby, my phone was already ringing with the call I'd been expecting since my father's funeral. James Morrison, the CEO of Midwest Financial Holdings, was ready to discuss my new role in the company and my ideas for improving customer service across our banking network. I answered the phone as I reached the center of the lobby, my voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect space. Jim, perfect timing. I'm actually standing in one of our branches right now, and I just had the most educational customer service experience. I think we need to have a conversation about management training and customer relations policies. Thomas, good to hear from you. Which branch are you visiting? First National Bank of Chicago, downtown location. I just met with the branch manager, and I have some serious concerns about how potential commercial customers are being treated. Behind me, I could see Mrs. Sterling emerging from her office, probably curious about who was making business calls in her lobby. Her expression shifted from mild annoyance to confusion as she recognized me, then to something approaching alarm as she began to catch fragments of my conversation. Jim, I'm going to need the personnel files for the management team here, particularly for a Mrs. Victoria Sterling. We may have a significant problem with discriminatory practices and customer service failures. Mrs. Sterling's face went pale as she realized what she was hearing. She began walking toward me, her confident stride faltering as the implications of my phone conversation sank in. "Mr. Williams?" she called out, her voice higher than it had been in her office. "Excuse me, Mr. Williams?" I held up one finger, continuing my conversation with the CEO. "Actually, Jim, the branch manager is approaching me now." Why don't I put you on speaker so we can address this situation directly? I tapped the speaker button and turned to face Mrs. Sterling, who had stopped about 10 feet away, her composed professional demeanor cracking as she began to understand that her world was about to change dramatically. Mrs. Sterling, I said clearly, my voice carrying across the quiet lobby, I'd like you to meet James Morrison, CEO of Midwest Financial Holdings, your boss's boss's boss. Jim, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Victoria Sterling, who just informed me that commercial banking services at this location aren't for people like me. The color drained completely from Mrs. Sterling's face as she stared at me, then at the phone in my hand, then back at me. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. "Mr. Morrison," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. There's been some kind of misunderstanding. Mrs. Sterling," CEO Morrison's voice came through the phone speaker, crisp and professional. "I'm going to need you to explain to me why you turned away a potential commercial customer without reviewing his qualifications. More importantly, I need you to explain what you meant when you told Mr. Williams that our services aren't for people like him." The lobby had grown quiet, with other customers and bank employees stopping their activities to listen to this unexpected drama unfolding. Mrs. Sterling looked around desperately, realizing that her career was potentially ending in front of an audience. "Mr. Morrison, I was simply trying to manage expectations. Mr. Williams didn't appear to have the background for our commercial programs, and I thought—" "You thought what, Mrs. Sterling?" I interrupted, my voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "You thought you could determine my qualifications based on how I looked rather than what I had to say. You thought you could dismiss me without even reviewing my financial information. No, that's not— I would never—" "Mrs. Sterling," CEO Morrison's voice cut through her stammering, "are you telling me that you refuse to review a potential customer's qualifications for commercial banking services?" I was trying to be helpful by telling him that our services weren't designed for people like him. "Mrs. Sterling, do you understand how that sounds?" The silence in the lobby was deafening. Mrs. Sterling looked around at the faces watching her. Customers, employees, security guards, all witnessing her professional humiliation. "Mr. Morrison," she said desperately, "if I could just speak with you privately." "No, Mrs. Sterling. This conversation is happening right here, right now, because this is where you chose to discriminate against a customer. And this is where you're going to face the consequences." I looked at Mrs. Sterling, seeing not the confident, dismissive woman who'd treated me like an inferior 30 minutes earlier, but someone whose world was collapsing in real time. "Mrs. Sterling," I said quietly, 7 minutes ago, you told me that people like me didn't belong in your world of commercial banking. You made assumptions about my background, my qualifications, and my worth as a customer based entirely on your prejudices. Mr. Williams, I'm so sorry. I never meant— What you meant, Mrs. Sterling, was that you saw a black man in an off-the-rack suit and decided he couldn't possibly be worth your time or attention. You saw someone you thought you could dismiss without consequences. The tears in her eyes were real, but they were tears of self-pity rather than genuine remorse. Mrs. Sterling was crying because she'd been caught, not because she understood the damage her attitude caused. "Jim," I said into the phone, "I think we've heard enough. Mrs. Victoria Sterling has demonstrated that she's not capable of representing our company's values or serving our diverse customer base appropriately." "I agree completely," CEO Morrison replied. "Mrs. Sterling, you're terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and HR will contact you about final paperwork and benefit transitions." Mrs. Sterling stared at me in shock, then at the phone, then back at me. You can't— This isn't fair." "What isn't fair, Mrs. Sterling, is treating customers differently based on your personal biases. What isn't fair is denying someone access to services they're qualified for because they don't fit your narrow definition of success." As security approached to escort Mrs. Sterling from the building, she made one final desperate attempt to save her career. "Mr. Williams, please. I have a family, a mortgage. I made a mistake, but I can learn from it. Please don't destroy my life over one conversation." I looked at this woman who had tried to destroy my dignity, who had dismissed me as unworthy of basic professional courtesy, who was now begging for mercy she hadn't shown me. "Mrs. Sterling, you didn't make a mistake. You revealed who you are. And who you are is someone who judges people's worth based on their appearance rather than their character or qualifications. But I can change. Perhaps you can. But you can't change here, and you can't change while in a position of power over people you've already demonstrated you don't respect." As security escorted Mrs. Sterling toward the exit, she turned back one final time. "This is revenge," she said, her voice bitter with defeat. "You planned this." "No, Mrs. Sterling. This is consequence. There's a difference." The lobby erupted in spontaneous applause from customers and employees who had witnessed the entire exchange. I turned off the phone and looked around at the faces surrounding me. People who understood that justice had been served, that someone who had abused her power had finally faced accountability. But this wasn't just about revenge or even justice. This was about sending a message that discrimination has consequences, that treating people differently based on prejudice is unacceptable, and that sometimes the person you underestimate has more power than you realize. As Mrs. Victoria Sterling disappeared through the bank's front doors, her career and reputation in ruins, I realized that my father's legacy wasn't just the money and business he'd left me. It was the lesson that respect must be earned, but dignity should never have to be. The woman who had told me that banking services weren't for people like me had just learned that people like me sometimes have the power to change everything. And sometimes justice comes swiftly and publicly, witnessed by everyone who needs to understand that discrimination will not be tolerated. The applause in the First National Bank lobby gradually died down as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Mrs. Victoria Sterling was gone, escorted out by security. Her 20-year banking career ended in a matter of minutes. I stood in the center of the marble-floored space, surrounded by customers and employees who were still processing the dramatic confrontation they'd witnessed. "Mr. Williams?" A nervous voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see a young woman in a bank uniform approaching hesitantly. "I'm Sandra Martinez, the assistant manager. I wanted to apologize for what just happened and see if there's anything I can do to help you with your banking needs." Sandra looked terrified, probably wondering if she was about to be fired as well. Her hands were shaking slightly as she clutched a folder of banking materials. "Thank you, Sandra. I appreciate that. But first, can you gather the staff for a brief meeting? I think we need to address what just occurred and discuss how this branch moves forward." "Of course, Mr. Williams. Should I call corporate?" "Corporate already knows what happened. I'm Thomas Williams, the new board member for Midwest Financial Holdings. What I want to focus on now is making sure this branch provides excellent service to all customers, regardless of their appearance or background." Sandra's eyes widened as she realized she was talking to someone with significant authority in the company. "Yes, sir. I'll gather everyone immediately." As Sandra hurried away to collect the staff, I took a moment to observe the branch more carefully. It was an impressive space. High ceilings, marble floors, expensive furniture, designed to convey stability and success. But I'd just learned that impressive appearances could hide ugly realities. The staff gathered in the main lobby area. 3 tellers, 2 customer service representatives, a loan officer, Sandra, and a security guard. They looked nervous, uncertain about what was expected of them in this unprecedented situation. "Good afternoon, everyone," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the lobby. "I'm Thomas Williams, and I've just joined the board of directors for Midwest Financial Holdings. What you witnessed here today was the termination of Mrs. Sterling for discriminatory behavior toward a potential customer." I paused, watching their faces. Some looked relieved, Others appeared worried about their own job security. I want to be clear about something. Mrs. Sterling wasn't fired for making a mistake or for having a bad day. She was fired for treating a customer differently based on assumptions about his race and economic status. That behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated at any level of this organization. Sandra raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Williams, what should we do if customers ask about what happened? The whole thing was pretty public. Tell them the truth. Tell them that Midwest Financial Holdings is committed to providing excellent service to all customers and that we take swift action when our standards aren't met. This should be a message to everyone, customers and employees alike, that discrimination has consequences. One of the tellers, an older black woman named Dorothy, spoke up. Mr. Williams, if you don't mind me saying what Mrs. Sterling did to you, she's done similar things before. Not as obvious, maybe, but I've seen her treat customers differently based on how they looked or talked. Can you give me specifics, Dorothy? Last month, a young Hispanic man came in asking about a car loan. He was dressed casually, spoke with an accent, and Mrs. Sterling barely listened to him before steering him toward a high-interest personal loan instead of the auto financing he'd asked about. Come to find out later, he was a doctor who'd just finished his residency. Another employee, James, nodded in agreement. She did something similar to an elderly Asian woman who wanted to open a business account. Mrs. Sterling kept talking to her very slowly and loudly, like she assumed the woman couldn't speak English properly. The woman had been a university professor for 30 years. I felt a familiar anger building in my chest. Mrs. Sterling's treatment of me hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had probably affected dozens of customers. Why didn't anyone report this behavior? Sandra looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Sterling was the branch manager. She controlled performance reviews, work schedules, promotion opportunities. Most of us couldn't afford to lose our jobs, and we didn't think anyone higher up would believe us over her. Gee. It was a depressing reminder of how power structures could protect bad actors while silencing the people who witnessed their behavior. That changes now, I said firmly. I want to establish a direct reporting system where any employee can report discrimination or unprofessional behavior without fear of retaliation. Sandra, I'm promoting you to interim branch manager while we search for a permanent replacement. Sandra's face showed shock and gratitude. Mr. Williams, thank you. I promise I'll do everything I can to serve our customers fairly and professionally. I know you will, and I want everyone here to understand that your job is not just to process transactions, it's to treat every customer with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived economic status. As the staff meeting concluded, I realized that Mrs. Sterling's firing was just the beginning. Real change would require ongoing effort to identify and eliminate discriminatory practices throughout the organization. My phone buzzed with a text from CEO Morrison. Thomas, the board is requesting a full report on today's incident. Can you meet with us tomorrow morning? I replied that I'd be there, then turned my attention back to the immediate situation. Several customers were waiting to conduct business, and I wanted to observe how the staff handled them in the wake of what had just happened. The difference was immediately apparent. Sandra and the other employees were more attentive, more patient, more willing to listen to what customers actually needed, rather than making assumptions. It was as if Mrs. Sterling's termination had freed them to provide the kind of service they'd always wanted to give. One customer, an elderly man with worn clothes and a tired demeanor, approached Sandra about cashing a check. Under Mrs. Sterling's management, he probably would have been treated with suspicion, subjected to excessive verification procedures, or made to feel unwelcome. Instead, Sandra greeted him warmly, processed his transaction efficiently, and thanked him for his business. "Excuse me, are you the gentleman who got that rude manager fired?" the elderly man asked me as he prepared to leave. "I am. Well, I want to thank you. That woman treated me like dirt every time I came in here, made me feel like I was bothering her just by existing. It's about time someone stood up to her." Similar conversations occurred throughout the afternoon as word of Mrs. Sterling's termination spread through the community. Customers who had felt discriminated against or dismissed began sharing their stories, painting a picture of systemic problems that went far beyond my personal experience. That evening, I drove to my father's house, now my house, in the affluent Lincoln Park neighborhood. It was a beautiful home that my father had purchased after his construction business became successful, a symbol of the American dream achieved through hard work and determination. I sat in his study, surrounded by the books and papers that had defined his business philosophy, and called my mentor, Professor David Chen, who had taught me about business ethics during my MBA program at Northwestern. "David, I wanted to run something by you. I just fired a bank manager for discriminatory behavior, and I'm wondering if I handled it appropriately. Tell me what happened." I recounted the entire incident from Mrs. Sterling's dismissive attitude to her termination in front of the entire lobby. "Thomas," Professor Chen said after I finished, "what you experienced was textbook discrimination, and your response was entirely appropriate. The public nature of her termination might seem harsh, but it serves an important purpose. It sends a clear message that such behavior has consequences. I'm worried that people might think I was being vindictive." "Were you being vindictive?" I considered the question carefully. "No, I was angry, but I wasn't trying to hurt her personally. I was trying to establish that discrimination won't be tolerated." "Then you did the right thing." "Thomas, people in positions of authority have a responsibility to use that authority ethically. Mrs. Sterling abused her position by treating customers differently based on her prejudices. You used your position to hold her accountable. There's a significant difference." After hanging up with Professor Chen, I spent the evening reviewing personnel files for the First National branch that CEO Morrison had sent over. Mrs. Sterling's performance reviews showed a pattern of complaints about her customer service, but these concerns had been minimized or ignored by previous management. Several employees had requested transfers to other branches, citing personality conflicts with Mrs. Sterling. Reading between the lines, it was clear that the problems I'd witnessed were long-standing and well-documented, even if they hadn't been addressed. The next morning, I arrived at the Midwest Financial Holdings corporate headquarters for my meeting with the board of directors. The conference room was filled with the kind of people I'd once thought I could never reach. Wealthy, powerful individuals who controlled billions of dollars in assets. "Thomas," CEO Morrison began, "we've all reviewed your report on yesterday's incident. The board is unanimously supportive of your actions, but we're concerned about the broader implications." Board member Patricia Walsh, a woman in her 60s with decades of banking experience, leaned forward. "Thomas, if Mrs. Sterling's behavior was as systematic as your report suggests, we may have legal liability issues. Customers who were discriminated against could file lawsuits, and they would be justified in doing so," I replied. "But our responsibility isn't just to avoid lawsuits, it's to ensure that our institutions serve all customers fairly and professionally." Another board member, Robert Kim, nodded in agreement. "Thomas is right. We need to view this as an opportunity to strengthen our customer service standards and eliminate discriminatory practices across all our branches." CEO Morrison pulled out a thick folder. "We've conducted preliminary reviews of complaint patterns across our network, and we've identified at least 12 other managers who show concerning customer service trends. The question is how to address these issues systematically." "We start with training," I suggested. "Comprehensive mandatory training for all customer-facing employees on cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, and professional customer service standards. And we establish clear consequences," added Patricia Walsh. "Employees need to understand that discriminatory behavior will result in immediate termination, regardless of their position or tenure." The meeting continued for 2 hours as we developed a comprehensive plan to address discrimination throughout the Midwest financial network. It would be expensive and time-consuming, but it was necessary to ensure that what happened to me and to countless other customers wouldn't happen again. As I left the corporate headquarters, I received a call from Sandra Martinez at the First National Branch. "Mr. Williams, I wanted to update you on something. We've had 17 customers come in today, specifically to thank us for firing Mrs. Sterling. Apparently, word has spread through the community and people are excited about the changes." "That's excellent news, Sandra. How are the employees adjusting?" "Everyone seems more relaxed, more willing to take time with customers. It's like a weight has been lifted from the entire branch. Oh, and we've opened 6 new accounts today. People who said they'd been avoiding this branch because of how Mrs. Sterling treated them." After hanging up, I realized that Mrs. Sterling's termination had created ripple effects beyond just holding one person accountable. It had begun a process of cultural change that would hopefully transform how the entire organization treated its diverse customer base. That evening, I returned to the First National Branch to observe the evening shift and talk with employees I hadn't met yet. The atmosphere was noticeably different, more welcoming, more professional, more focused on actual customer service rather than making judgments about who deserved attention. As I prepared to leave, Dorothy, the senior teller, approached me. "Mr. Williams, I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday. I've been working in banks for 25 years, and I've seen too many good people treated badly because of the color of their skin or the clothes they wore. It took courage to stand up to Mrs. Sterling the way you did. Dorothy, I had advantages that most customers don't have: position, resources, connections. I used those advantages not just for myself, but hopefully for everyone who might face similar discrimination." "That's what makes it meaningful," she replied. "You could have just taken your business elsewhere and forgotten about it. Instead, you used your power to make things better for people you'll probably never meet." As I drove home that night, I thought about my father and the lessons he'd taught me about using success responsibly. He'd always said that achieving something meaningful required more than just personal advancement. It required lifting others up as well. Mrs. Victoria Sterling had tried to diminish me, to make me feel like I didn't belong in her world of banking and business. Instead, she'd given me an opportunity to demonstrate that dignity and respect aren't privileges to be earned. They're rights to be protected. The woman who had told me that banking services weren't for people like me was gone, but the work of building a more inclusive and fair financial system was just beginning. 2 weeks after Mrs. Sterling's termination, I arrived at my office at Midwest Financial Holdings to find CEO Morrison waiting with a stack of newspapers and a concerned expression. "Thomas, we need to talk," he said, spreading the papers across my desk. "The Sterling incident has attracted more attention than we anticipated." The headlines were dramatic. "Banking executive fires manager for racism in public confrontation," "Discrimination exposed in Chicago bank lobby," "New board member takes swift action against prejudice." "Is this a problem?" I asked, scanning the articles. "It depends on your perspective. We've received over 200 media requests for interviews, dozens of calls from civil rights organizations wanting to discuss our policies, and—" Morrison paused. "A call from Mrs. Sterling's attorney threatening a wrongful termination lawsuit." I set down the newspapers and looked at Morrison carefully. "Jim, are you having second thoughts about supporting my actions?" "Not at all. But I want to make sure you're prepared for what comes next. This story has legs, and it's going to generate scrutiny of our entire organization." My phone buzzed with a call from Sandra Martinez at the First National Branch. "Mr. Williams, we have a situation here that I think you need to know about." "What kind of situation?" "Mrs. Sterling is outside the bank with a news crew, claiming she was fired unfairly and demanding to speak with you. She's been here for an hour, and it's drawing a crowd." I looked at Morrison, who had overheard Sandra's call. "Jim, it looks like the scrutiny is starting right now." 30 minutes later, Morrison and I arrived at the First National Branch to find a media circus. 3 news vans were parked outside, reporters were interviewing customers and passers-by, and Victoria Sterling stood on the sidewalk in an expensive suit, playing the role of wronged victim for the cameras. "There he is," Sterling called out as she spotted me approaching. "That's Thomas Williams, the man who destroyed my career based on a misunderstanding." Reporters immediately surrounded us, shoving microphones and cameras in our faces. Morrison stepped forward to handle the media, but I knew this confrontation was inevitable. "Mrs. Sterling," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "would you like to explain to these reporters exactly what you said to me that led to your termination?" "I was trying to help you understand our lending requirement," she replied, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I remembered so well. "I never said anything discriminatory. So when you told me that commercial banking services weren't for people like me, what exactly did you mean by people like me?" The crowd of reporters grew quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Sterling looked around nervously, realizing that her attempt to play victim was backfiring. "I meant people without established business credit, people who—" "Mrs. Sterling," I interrupted, "I have $12 million in assets and active contracts with Fortune 500 companies. What part of my qualifications suggested I lacked business experience?" Sterling's lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Mr. Williams, my client was following standard banking procedures by telling a customer that banking services weren't designed for people like him before reviewing any of his qualifications." I turned to address the reporters directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Thomas Williams, board member of Midwest Financial Holdings. I walked into this bank 2 weeks ago as a potential customer, dressed professionally and carrying documentation for a legitimate business loan application. I pulled out the folder I'd brought that day, still carrying my father's business plans and financial records. Mrs. Sterling took one look at me, a black man in an off-the-rack suit, and decided I wasn't worth her time. She never reviewed my documentation, never asked about my business experience, never treated me with the basic respect that any customer deserves." "That's not true," Sterling protested, but her voice lacked conviction. One of the reporters, a sharp-eyed woman from Chicago Tribune, stepped forward. "Mrs. Sterling, are you saying you did review Mr. Williams's financial qualifications before determining he wasn't suitable for commercial banking services?" Sterling's face flushed as she realized the trap she'd walked into. I made an assessment based on what?" the reporter pressed. "His appearance? His race?" Sterling's lawyer quickly intervened. "This interview is over. My client has no further comment." As they tried to push through the crowd of reporters, Sterling turned back to shout at me. "You planned this. You set me up." "Mrs. Sterling," I called back, my voice carrying clearly over the noise of the crowd, "I didn't plan anything. I simply walked into a bank asking for service and was told I didn't belong there. Everything that happened after that was your choice." The media circus continued for another hour, with reporters interviewing customers, employees, and community members about discrimination in banking. The story that emerged painted a clear picture of systemic problems that extended far beyond one incident. Dorothy, the senior teller, agreed to speak with reporters. "Mrs. Sterling treated customers differently based on how they looked," she said on camera. "I've seen her dismiss people who turned out to be doctors, business owners, successful professionals, all because she made assumptions about them." Several customers came forward with their own stories of discriminatory treatment at the branch. The young Hispanic doctor who'd been steered toward high-interest loans, the Asian professor who'd been spoken to like a child, the elderly black man who'd been made to feel unwelcome, all spoke publicly about their experiences. That evening, the story led the local news on 3 major networks. The coverage was extensive and damaging to Sterling's claims of innocence. Video footage of her confrontation with me showed her arrogance and condescension clearly, while interviews with other customers established a pattern of discriminatory behavior. The next morning, I received a call from Sterling's attorney. "Mr. Williams, my client would like to discuss a settlement." "A settlement for what? She's the one threatening to sue us." "Mrs. Sterling is prepared to drop her wrongful termination claims in exchange for a positive reference letter and a confidentiality agreement. I almost laughed. Your client wants us to lie about why she was fired and agree never to discuss her discriminatory behavior. She wants an opportunity to rebuild her career without this incident following her forever. The same opportunity she denied to every customer she treated with contempt and disrespect? I don't think so. Sterling's attorney tried a different approach. Mr. Williams, continued media coverage of this incident could be damaging to your bank as well. Wouldn't it be better for everyone to move on quietly? Actually, the media coverage has been excellent for our business. We've opened over 100 new accounts in the past 2 weeks from customers who appreciate our commitment to fair treatment. We've also received inquiries from several major corporations about moving their banking relationships to institutions that take discrimination seriously. It was true. The publicity from Sterling's termination had generated significant positive attention for Midwest Financial Holdings. Rather than damaging our reputation, the incident had enhanced it by demonstrating our commitment to equality and customer service. A week later, I received another call that would show just how far the ripples from Sterling's firing had spread. Mr. Williams, this is Janet Rodriguez from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. We'd like to discuss your recent experience with discrimination in banking and explore whether similar issues exist at other institutions. The Federal Reserve was launching an investigation into discriminatory lending and customer service practices across the region, using the Sterling incident as a starting point. Their preliminary research had identified concerning patterns at multiple financial institutions. Mr. Williams, would you be willing to testify before a congressional subcommittee about discrimination in banking? Your experience has highlighted systemic issues that Congress needs to address. I agreed immediately. Mrs. Sterling's attempt to humiliate me had accidentally exposed problems that affected thousands of customers across the country. 2 months after the initial incident, I found myself sitting at a witness table in a congressional hearing room, facing a panel of senators and representatives who were investigating discrimination in financial services. Mr. Williams, the committee chairman began, can you describe for the committee what happened when you visited First National Bank of Chicago? I recounted the entire incident, from Sterling's dismissive attitude to her termination. The hearing room was packed with reporters, banking industry representatives, and civil rights advocates. And what has been the response from your company? Asked Senator Patricia Davis. We've implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, established clear reporting procedures for discriminatory behavior, and terminated 12 additional managers who showed patterns of biased customer treatment. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with testimony from banking customers, civil rights experts, and industry representatives. The evidence of widespread discrimination was overwhelming and undeniable. During a break, I was approached by Maria Santos, a civil rights attorney who had been monitoring the proceedings. Mr. Williams, what happened to you has inspired dozens of other customers to come forward with their own stories. We're filing a class action lawsuit against several major banks for systematic discrimination in lending and customer service. How can I help? Keep doing what you're doing. Use your position to create real change in the industry. The fact that you had the power to fire that manager immediately, that sent a message that discrimination has consequences. The congressional hearing resulted in new federal regulations requiring banks to track and report customer service complaints by demographic categories, implement mandatory anti-bias training, and establish independent review processes for discrimination claims. Mrs. Victoria Sterling never found another position in banking. Her attempt to sue for wrongful termination failed when multiple witnesses testified about her discriminatory behavior. The last I heard, she was working in retail sales, far from any position of authority over vulnerable customers. But the real victory wasn't Sterling's downfall. It was the systematic changes that her termination had sparked. Banks across the country were suddenly paying attention to how they treated customers, implementing training programs, and establishing accountability measures. 6 months after that humiliating day in the First National lobby, I received a letter that brought everything full circle. Mr. Williams, you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for what you did. I'm a young Latina who recently graduated from business school, and I was looking for a bank to help me start my consulting firm. After seeing the news coverage of your experience, I decided to visit the First National branch where it all happened. The staff there treated me with incredible respect and professionalism. They took time to understand my business plan, connected me with appropriate resources, and helped me secure the funding I needed. I know that wouldn't have happened before you stood up to that manager. Thank you for making it possible for people like me to be treated with dignity. Isabella Chen, CEO, Chen Business Solutions. I kept Isabella's letter on my desk as a reminder of why I'd chosen to confront Sterling publicly rather than simply taking my business elsewhere. It wasn't about revenge or personal satisfaction. It was about ensuring that other customers would be treated with the respect and professionalism that everyone deserves. The woman who had told me that banking services weren't for people like me had inadvertently launched a movement that made those services more accessible and fair for everyone. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected confrontations, and sometimes the people who try to diminish others end up elevating them instead. 8 months after Victoria Sterling's termination, I received a call that would test everything I thought I knew about justice, redemption, and the consequences of our actions. Mr. Williams, this is Dr. Patricia Walsh from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about Victoria Sterling. I believe you know her from your banking incident. She's been admitted to our psychiatric unit following a suicide attempt. My stomach dropped. Despite everything Sterling had done, despite the justified anger I'd felt toward her, I took no pleasure in learning that she was suffering. Will she be all right? Physically, yes. But Mr. Williams, she's been asking to speak with you. She says there are things she needs to tell you, things that might help you understand why she acted the way she did. I sat in silence for a long moment, processing this unexpected development. Part of me never wanted to see Victoria Sterling again, never wanted to relive the humiliation she'd tried to inflict on me. But another part of me recognized that understanding the roots of discrimination might be important for preventing it in others. I'll come, I said finally. Northwestern Memorial's psychiatric unit was a sobering place, quiet hallways, locked doors, and the kind of sterile atmosphere that spoke of profound human pain. Dr. Walsh met me at the nurses' station and briefed me on Sterling's condition. She's been struggling with severe depression since losing her job. The public nature of her termination, the media coverage, the inability to find new employment, it all took a significant toll on her mental health. Doctor, I need you to understand that I don't feel responsible for her mental health crisis. What happened to her was a direct consequence of her own discriminatory behavior. I'm not suggesting you're responsible, Mr. Williams, but Victoria has information about systemic discrimination in the banking industry that might be valuable. She's also expressed genuine remorse for her actions, not just regret about being caught, but actual understanding of the harm she caused. Dr. Walsh led me to a small conference room where Victoria Sterling was waiting. She looked nothing like the confident, dismissive woman I'd encountered 8 months earlier. She'd lost significant weight. Her hair was unkempt, and her eyes carried the haunted look of someone who'd lost everything. "Thomas," she said quietly, as I entered the room. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Mrs. Sterling, Dr. Walsh says you wanted to speak with me." She nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I wanted to apologize, really apologize. Not the fake corporate apology I tried to give in front of the cameras. And I wanted to explain something about why I treated you the way I did." I sat down, curious, despite my reservations about this meeting. "Thomas, what I did to you was wrong, completely, Inexcusably wrong. I treated you with contempt based on nothing but my own prejudices and assumptions. Why? Why did you immediately assume I wasn't worth your time? Sterling was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the table. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because that's how I was trained. Not officially, not in any written policy, but through years of watching other managers, years of learning which customers were considered valuable and which ones were seen as problems to be managed or dismissed. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with shame. Thomas, I grew up in a wealthy white suburb where I rarely interacted with black people except as service workers. When I started in banking, the senior managers, all white men, taught me that customers like you were usually time wasters, people who couldn't qualify for our premium services, but who would take up valuable time that could be spent on real customers. So you just accepted that teaching. I didn't just accept it, I internalized it. Over 20 years in banking, I developed a mental shortcut system for categorizing customers the moment they walked through the door. Well-dressed white man in an expensive suit, priority customer. Anyone else? Manage their expectations and move them along quickly. Sterling's confession was disturbing but not surprising. She was describing the kind of unconscious bias training that I'd been trying to implement across our banking network. But Thomas, here's what I need you to understand. I wasn't just following learned behavior that day. I was actively angry at you. Angry at me? Why? Because you challenged my assumptions. When you walked into my office talking about 7-figure business operations and Fortune 500 contracts, you forced me to confront the possibility that my categorization system was wrong. And instead of adjusting my thinking, I doubled down on my prejudices. Sterling leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. I was so invested in being right about who you were that I couldn't allow myself to consider who you actually were. When you mentioned calling your lawyer, when you started speaking with confidence and authority, I felt threatened. Threatened by what? By the possibility that I'd been wrong about people like you for my entire career. If Thomas Williams could be a successful businessman worthy of commercial banking services, then how many other customers had I dismissed unfairly? How many opportunities had I cost the bank? How many people had I hurt with my assumptions? It was a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected from Sterling. She wasn't just acknowledging her discriminatory behavior. She was analyzing the psychological mechanisms that had driven it. Mrs. Sterling, why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to understand that what happened between us wasn't an isolated incident of one bad manager having a bad day. It was the product of systemic training and cultural reinforcement that exists throughout the banking industry. Sterling pulled out a folder that had been sitting beside her chair. I've spent the past 8 months documenting everything I can remember about discriminatory practices at every bank I've worked for. Training sessions where we were taught to identify undesirable customers, performance metrics that rewarded steering certain demographic groups away from premium services, management strategies for limiting access to banking products. She handed me the folder, which was filled with detailed notes, names, and specific examples of institutional discrimination. Thomas, I'm giving this to you because you have the power to do something about it. You're on the board of a major financial institution. You have credibility with regulators and legislators, and you've already demonstrated that you're willing to take action against discrimination. I flipped through Sterling's documentation, realizing that it represented evidence of systematic civil rights violations across multiple institutions. This could destroy careers, cost banks millions in lawsuits. Good. The system that created me, that taught me to treat people like you with contempt, needs to be destroyed. Maybe something better can be built in its place. We sat in silence for several minutes as I processed what Sterling had told me. Her apology felt genuine, her self-analysis seemed honest, and her documentation could be invaluable for creating real change in the banking industry. Mrs. Sterling, what do you want from me? Nothing for myself. My career in banking is over, and it should be. I violated the trust that customers placed in me, and I hurt people who deserved better treatment. She paused, looking directly at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. But I want you to use this information to prevent other customers from experiencing what I put you through. And I want you to know that what happened in that bank lobby changed me fundamentally. Changed you how? It forced me to confront the reality of who I'd become. For 20 years, I thought I was a professional banker, providing appropriate customer service. Your confrontation made me realize I was actually a gatekeeper who used my position to deny opportunities to people I deemed unworthy. Sterling stood up, preparing to end our conversation. Thomas, I'll never be able to undo the harm I caused, not just to you, but to hundreds of other customers over the years. But maybe the information I've gathered can prevent future harm. As I prepared to leave, Sterling made one final request. Will you tell people that I'm sorry? Not for getting caught, not for losing my job, but for every customer I treated badly, every opportunity I denied, every moment I made someone feel less worthy because of my prejudices. I'll tell them, I promised. Driving home from the hospital, I thought about the complexity of human nature and the possibility of redemption even after terrible behavior. Sterling's apology didn't erase the discrimination she'd practiced, but her willingness to expose the systemic problems that had shaped her actions could help prevent similar discrimination in the future. That evening, I called CEO Morrison to discuss Sterling's documentation. Jim, we need to have an emergency board meeting. I have evidence of systematic discrimination practices that go far beyond what we discovered at the First National Branch. How reliable is this evidence? It comes from someone who participated in these practices for 20 years and is now willing to testify about them publicly. The emergency board meeting took place 2 days later. Sterling's documentation painted a disturbing picture of institutional discrimination that extended across multiple banks and involved deliberate policies designed to limit certain demographic groups' access to banking services. Ladies and gentlemen, I told the board, we're not dealing with isolated incidents of individual bias. We're looking at systematic practices that have been embedded in banking culture for decades. Board member Patricia Walsh reviewed Sterling's notes with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years in regulatory compliance. Thomas, if even half of this is accurate, we're looking at potential federal civil rights violations at a scale we've never seen, which is why we need to get ahead of this. We need to conduct a comprehensive review of our own practices, implement immediate corrective measures, and cooperate fully with federal investigators. The board voted unanimously to launch an internal investigation and to share Sterling's documentation with federal regulators. It would be expensive and embarrassing, but it was the right thing to do. 6 months later, Sterling's information had led to the largest banking discrimination investigation in federal history. 12 major banks were fined a combined $2.3 billion, hundreds of managers were terminated, and new federal regulations were implemented to prevent systematic discrimination. Victoria Sterling never returned to banking, but she did testify before Congress about the institutional practices that had shaped her discriminatory behavior. Her testimony was painful to watch, but invaluable for understanding how discrimination becomes embedded in corporate culture. The last time I saw her was at a civil rights conference, where she was speaking about unconscious bias in financial services. She looked healthier, more at peace with herself, though still carrying the weight of what she'd done. Thomas, she said after her presentation, I wanted you to know that I've been working with civil rights organizations to develop training programs for bank employees. It's not enough to undo the harm I caused, but it's something. Mrs. Sterling, I hope you find peace with what you've done and who you've become. I'm trying. And Thomas, thank you for not letting me hide from the consequences of my actions. If you'd accepted a quiet settlement or let the incident fade away, none of these systematic changes would have happened. As I watched Sterling walk away, I realized that our confrontation in the bank lobby had created ripple effects neither of us could have anticipated. Her discrimination had been inexcusable, but her willingness to expose the system that had created her had helped prevent countless future incidents of discrimination. Sometimes the most important changes come from the most unlikely sources, and sometimes the people who cause the most harm can also contribute to the most healing. The woman who had told me that banking services weren't for people like me had ultimately helped ensure that they would be available for everyone, regardless of their appearance, background, or the assumptions others made about their worth. 2 years after Victoria Sterling's termination, I stood before the American Banking Association's annual conference, delivering a keynote address about diversity and inclusion in financial services. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was speaking to an audience of bank executives, many of whom had probably practiced the same kind of discrimination that Sterling had shown me. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, looking out at the sea of mostly white faces. 2 years ago, I walked into one of our own banks and was told that commercial banking services weren't designed for people like me. Today, I want to talk about what we've learned since then and where we go from here. The audience was attentive but tense. The Sterling incident had become a case study in business schools and diversity training programs across the country. Everyone in that room knew the story, and many were probably wondering if their own institutions had similar problems. The easy response to what happened would be to dismiss Victoria Sterling as one bad actor whose behavior didn't reflect broader industry practices. But that would be a lie, and it would be a missed opportunity for real change. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a graph showing customer service complaint patterns by demographic categories across major banks. What we discovered through our investigation is that the Sterling incident wasn't an anomaly. It was representative of systematic practices that have been embedded in banking culture for decades. The data was stark and undeniable. Across multiple institutions, customers of color were significantly more likely to be denied loans they qualified for, steered toward higher interest products, or subjected to excessive verification procedures. But here's what's encouraging, I continued, clicking to the next slide. In the 2 years since we began implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training and accountability measures, we've seen dramatic improvements in customer satisfaction and business outcomes across all demographic groups. The results were impressive. Midwest Financial Holdings had increased minority business lending by 340%, opened over 50,000 new accounts in underserved communities, and achieved the highest customer satisfaction ratings in our company's history. It turns out that treating all customers with dignity and respect isn't just the right thing to do morally, it's also excellent business strategy. During the Q&A session, a bank president from Texas raised his hand. "Mr. Williams, the training programs you're describing sound expensive and time-consuming. How do you justify the cost to shareholders?" It was exactly the kind of question I'd expected, focusing on cost rather than value, treating discrimination prevention as an expense rather than an investment. "Sir, let me ask you a different question. How do you justify to shareholders the cost of losing customers, facing discrimination lawsuits, dealing with regulatory fines, and damaging your institution's reputation? Because those are the costs of not addressing discrimination." I clicked to a slide showing the financial impact of discrimination on the banking industry. Last year alone, banks paid over $3.2 billion in discrimination-related fines and settlements. They lost an estimated $12 billion in potential revenue from customers who took their business elsewhere due to poor treatment. Compare that to the cost of comprehensive training programs, usually less than $50,000 per branch annually. And tell me which approach makes better financial sense. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of executives wanting to learn more about our training programs and accountability measures. The conversation had shifted from whether to address discrimination to how to address it most effectively, but the most meaningful interaction came from an unexpected source. A young black woman approached me as I was packing up my materials. "Mr. Williams, I'm Angela Foster, a branch manager trainee with First Community Bank in Atlanta. I wanted to thank you for what you did." "Thank you, Angela. Are you finding the banking industry welcoming?" Her smile was complicated. "It's better than it was, thanks to people like you pushing for change. But I still face challenges that my white colleagues don't experience." "What kind of challenges?" "Customers who ask to speak with a real manager when they see me. Colleagues who assume I'm in my position because of affirmative action rather than qualifications. Training programs that teach cultural sensitivity but don't address the underlying power structures that perpetuate discrimination." Angela's observations reminded me that changing individual behavior was only the first step in addressing systematic discrimination. Real change required examining and modifying the institutional structures that had created and maintained discriminatory practices. "Angela, would you be willing to participate in a working group I'm forming? We're developing next-generation diversity and inclusion strategies that go beyond basic sensitivity training." "Absolutely. Mr. Williams, people like me need advocates like you. People with power who are willing to use it for positive change." 6 months later, our working group had developed a comprehensive framework for addressing institutional discrimination in financial services. The key innovation was focusing on systemic changes rather than just individual behavior modification. Instead of simply training employees to recognize their biases, we implemented structural changes that made discrimination more difficult to practice. Automated loan approval systems that removed human bias from initial screening, customer service quality metrics that tracked satisfaction across demographic groups, promotion and compensation policies that rewarded inclusive behavior, leadership diversity requirements that ensured decision-making bodies reflected customer demographics. The pilot program was launched at 50 branches across 5 states, with dramatic results. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment dropped by 78%, minority business lending increased by 290%, and overall profitability improved by 23% as banks accessed previously underserved markets. But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. I received a letter from Victoria Sterling, who had been following our progress from her new position as a diversity consultant for a civil rights organization. "Thomas, I wanted you to know that the systematic changes you've implemented go far beyond anything I thought possible when we first confronted each other in that bank lobby. You've taken my documentation of discriminatory practices and used it to create solutions that address root causes rather than just symptoms. The framework you've developed is being studied by banks across the country, and it's making a real difference in how customers are treated. I know I can never fully atone for the harm I caused during my banking career, but seeing the positive changes that emerged from our confrontation gives me hope that some good came from something terrible. Thank you for turning my failure into an opportunity for systematic improvement." Victoria, reading Sterling's letter, I realized that our confrontation had evolved far beyond a simple case of individual accountability. It had become a catalyst for industry-wide change that was benefiting thousands of customers and employees. A year later, I was invited to testify before Congress again, this time about the success of our systematic approach to eliminating discrimination in banking. "Mr. Williams," the committee chairman asked, "what would you say to bank executives who argue that diversity and inclusion initiatives are politically motivated rather than business-focused?" "Senator, I'd tell them to look at our results. Banks that have implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination programs are outperforming their competitors in customer acquisition, customer satisfaction, employee retention, and profitability." And what about the argument that these programs are reverse discrimination against white employees? "Senator, treating all customers and employees fairly isn't discrimination against anyone. It's basic professional competence, A bank that can't serve its entire community effectively is a bank that's failing at its core mission. I pulled out a folder of testimonials from employees at banks that had implemented our programs. These are letters from white employees who say the anti-discrimination training made them better at their jobs, more confident in customer interactions, and more proud of their workplace. Eliminating discrimination doesn't hurt anyone, it helps everyone. The congressional hearing resulted in new federal requirements for diversity training and systematic bias elimination in federally regulated financial institutions. What had started as one woman's discriminatory behavior in a Chicago bank lobby had become national policy, affecting thousands of banks and millions of customers. 5 years after Victoria Sterling told me that banking services weren't for people like me, I stood in the lobby of that same First National Bank branch, now renamed the Robert Williams Community Banking Center, in honor of my father's commitment to economic empowerment. The space looked different, warmer, more welcoming, with customer service areas designed to be accessible and comfortable for people from all backgrounds. Photos on the walls showed the diverse faces of customers and employees, and multilingual signage made clear that everyone was welcome. Sandra Martinez, now the permanent branch manager, approached with a smile that reflected genuine pride in what we'd accomplished. "Thomas, I wanted to show you something," she said, leading me to a display case near the entrance. Inside was a framed copy of the civil rights legislation that had emerged from our anti-discrimination efforts, signed by the president and bearing a plaque that read, "Dedicated to all customers who refuse to accept this isn't for people like you," as an answer. "We get visitors from other banks almost every week," Sandra continued. "People want to understand how we transformed our culture so completely. Yesterday, we had a delegation from Japan studying our diversity training programs. As we toured the branch, I was struck by the energy and professionalism of the staff. They treated every customer, regardless of age, race, language, or apparent economic status, with the same courtesy and attention. It was banking as it should be, banking as my father would have envisioned it. Sandra, what happened to the employees who worked here under Mrs. Sterling? Most of them are still here, and they're thriving. It's amazing how much better people perform when they're not operating in a toxic environment. Dorothy retired last year, but she still comes by to volunteer with our financial literacy programs. We walked to the community room, where Dorothy was teaching a class on small business banking to a diverse group of aspiring entrepreneurs. She spotted me and waved me over. "Thomas, perfect timing. I was just telling these folks about how you changed everything here." "Dorothy changed things too," I told the class. "She had the courage to speak up about problems she'd witnessed, even when it might have cost her job. Real change requires people at every level willing to stand up for what's right." One of the students, a young Latina woman, raised her hand. "Mr. Williams, I heard that the woman who discriminated against you eventually helped expose systematic problems in banking. Is that true?" "It is. Victoria Sterling made terrible choices that hurt many people, but in the end, she chose to help prevent others from experiencing the discrimination she'd practiced. People are complicated, and sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected sources." After the class, I walked to my car, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. My phone buzzed with a text from Angela Foster, who was now a regional vice president for community banking in Atlanta. "Thomas, our branch just won the state award for inclusive customer service. Thank you for showing us that change is possible." That evening, I attended a dinner hosted by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, where I was receiving an award for leadership in civil rights. The ballroom was filled with activists, business leaders, and community members who had fought various battles against discrimination and inequality. Thomas Williams, the presenter announced, transformed a personal experience with discrimination into systematic change that has benefited millions of Americans. His work demonstrates that individual courage can create institutional transformation. As I accepted the award, I thought about my father, who had built his construction business despite facing discrimination that was often more overt than what I'd experienced. He'd taught me that success carried obligations to family, to community, and to future generations who would face similar challenges. "This award doesn't belong to me," I said to the audience. "It belongs to every customer who has ever been told this isn't for people like you and refused to accept that answer. It belongs to every employee who has had the courage to speak up about discrimination they witnessed. It belongs to everyone who believes that our institutions should serve all Americans with dignity and respect." The applause was warm and sustained. But the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a young black teenager approached me with his parents. "Mr. Williams, I'm Marcus Thompson, and I want to be a banker when I grow up. My parents told me about what you did, and I wanted to thank you for making it possible for people like me to work in banking." Looking at young Marcus, I saw the future that our efforts had helped create. A generation that would grow up expecting fair treatment, that would enter the banking industry with different assumptions and higher standards than previous generations. "Marcus, remember that being a banker isn't just about handling money. It's about helping people achieve their dreams. Whether someone wants to buy their first home, start a business, or save for their children's education, you have the power to make those dreams possible or to crush them with bias and discrimination. I understand, Mr. Williams. I promise to treat every customer the way I'd want my family to be treated." 6 months later, I received one final communication that brought the story full circle. A package arrived at my office with no return address, containing a single sheet of paper and a small wooden plaque. The letter was from Victoria Sterling. "Thomas, I wanted you to know that I've completed my degree in social work and have been accepted into a PhD program focusing on institutional discrimination. The work you've done to transform banking practices has inspired me to dedicate the rest of my life to fighting the kind of systematic bias I once perpetuated. I know I can never fully atone for the harm I caused, but maybe I can prevent future harm. The plaque is something I made in woodworking therapy. It's my way of acknowledging that what happened between us changed both our lives, hopefully for the better. Thank you for showing me that accountability and redemption are both possible." Victoria. The wooden plaque bore a simple inscription: "This is for people like you, all people." I placed Victoria's plaque on my desk, where it served as a daily reminder that change is possible, that people can grow beyond their worst actions, and that fighting discrimination benefits everyone, including those who once practiced it. 10 years after that humiliating encounter in a bank lobby, the financial services industry looked fundamentally different. Discrimination hadn't been eliminated entirely, but it was no longer tolerated or ignored. Banks competed not just on interest rates and services, but on their commitment to inclusive customer treatment. The legislation that emerged from our efforts had been adopted in 12 other countries, creating a global movement toward more equitable financial services. Business schools taught case studies about the Sterling transformation, and diversity consultants used our framework to address discrimination in other industries. But the most important measure of success was simpler. Millions of Americans could now walk into banks knowing they would be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, accent, or assumptions others might make about their worth. The woman who had told me that banking services weren't for people like me had inadvertently sparked a revolution that made those services more accessible for everyone. Sometimes the most important changes begin with someone saying no to injustice, even when, especially when, they have the power to make that no stick. Victoria Sterling had tried to diminish me, to make me feel unworthy of basic professional courtesy. Instead, she had challenged me to use my position and resources to ensure that no one else would face the discrimination she had shown me. In the end, her attempt to exclude had created inclusion, her discrimination had sparked equality, and her abuse of power had led to systematic changes that protected the powerless. The foundation of fairness we'd built was solid and lasting, and everyone was welcome to build upon it.